had issues. They've had issues with legitimacy, most especially from the Western world. Now, the Western world that was so much doing a lot of funding on the projects that they were carrying out, of course, through the IMF and the World Bank, all these programs were a little bit sabotaged. Not forgetting that one of the biggest drone headquarters was in this country. Actually, the biggest drone headquarters on the African continent was in what we call Agadez. Now, Agadez is almost one of the entry points when you're entering into the Sahara. Now, we're talking about the Sahel region. The Sahel region, this is the part of West Africa that's between the East Africa and the Sahara Desert. Now, Agadez was one of the biggest military headquarters or drone headquarters that is located in Africa, and it was in Niger as you're moving upwards on the side of the Sahara. Now, this Agadez military point, it was an American military base, but it was taken away. It was taken away. The people in Niger attacked, and they chased away all the foreigners with the support from the Africa Corps. Africa Corps, we're talking about the Russian military what? The Russian paramilitary that has been in that very region, ensuring that they give a lot of support in this very region. So this headquarters, which was an American project, it was taken away from the Americans by the people themselves. Now, the people in Niger, of course, after the military coup, they rose up and chased away all the French and chased away all the Americans at Agadez. Now, Niger is also one of the countries that a little bit are forbidden in that very region. But of course, they are trying to get their businesses together and the establishment of a refinery. Now, this refinery, it's going to be a refinery, but they are going to put it at almost the border with Benin. Now, as you're moving from Niger, because Niger has neighbors, if you happen to look at where Niger is, it has neighborhood. It's in the neighborhood of Libya, and then they have Nigeria being one of their biggest trading patterns. That's in the eastern side. But as you're moving this side of the west, their biggest immediate neighbor is Benin. Now, the pipeline is going to move from Niger, and then it's going to come to this side of Benin, and then it's going to connect to what we call the Atlantic waters, because Niger is almost landlocked. So definitely, for them to be in a position to have access to the Atlantic waters, they need to have access through Benin. Now, this project is a project that is going to take between $4 to $6 billion. It's a Chinese investment firm, the National Petroleum Company from China, that is investing this money to ensure that the people of Niger are in a position to benefit from their natural oil. Niger is one of the biggest, most populated countries within that area. Actually, it's more populated than even Senegal, because Senegal is around 18 to 20 million people, but Niger is between 28 to 30 million people. So it's a little bit of a more populated area within that region. So of course, Ibrahim Tchamiane, now that he's in leadership, they've been in a position to sign up a deal that's going to ensure that oils and most of the resources that were so much exploited by the French are now under their control, and they have a say as far as that is concerned. So this is a new development. You don't have to forget that Africa is changing the narrative. The discussion about African resources is changing. So many African individual leaders or different leaders are speaking a language that is talking about resource capture. Resource capture is when you get your resources and put them under your control. President Museveni has always been talking about resource capture here, that why should we take away our gold just like that? Why should we take away our coffee just like that? One of the biggest steps that the president was in a position to put forward was to establish an oil refinery, which is also funded by a firm from UAE. And we believe by 2031, this oil refinery of Uganda is going to be ready, which will be in a position to produce almost 60,000 barrels of oil, on a daily basis. So this is something that's going to be a little bit very instrumental to ensure that when African countries, African leadership starts speaking about resource capture, Museveni is speaking the same. If you go to Rwanda, you hear Kagame speaking of the same. Kagame is embarking on a project that's going to ensure that there is nuclear production they are going to enrich their uranium in Congo. I mean, I'm saying that because Rwanda is almost encroaching on the Congolese resources. But if they also have their uranium, they are also going to process their uranium. That's a conversation that we had from Rwanda. The project was signed last week. Last week, yes, it was renegotiated, but that project has been on for the last 3-4 years, where Rwanda went into a conversation with a Russian firm to ensure that they get involved into uranium enrichment. So that some of the African countries, and of course Aliko Dangote is almost leading this kind of narrative on the African continent. So when you see a little bit of a wind of change coming amongst the leaderships in Africa, of course, even when you move to Libya, I mean to the downland part of South Africa, and you talk about countries like Botswana, in Gaborone, you talk about Namibia, you talk about Windhoek, if you talk about the leaders like Nandi Tumbo Ndaitwa, that's the leader of Namibia in Windhoek. She has always been talking about the diamond because these countries have a lot of diamond in there. So Nandi Tumbo Ndaitwa, the president of Namibia, has also been talking about using the diamonds to benefit the people of Namibia, and of course they are trying to grow with the German exploitation. Germany was one of the countries that has exploited Namibia for so long, not forgetting about the Nama and Hero rebellion, where a German leader was a gentleman, very, very terrible gentleman, one of the races that killed so many people. Almost 100,000 people were killed during what you call the Nama and the Hero rebellion. That was a gentleman called Geno Ventrosa. That is in Namibia. That was in 1900. Yeah, I think 1900, between 1900 to 1902. Around that time, if you remember the Nama and the Hero rebellion, Geno Ventrosa was in a position to lock up the people of the Herero. They locked them up in the desert and they starved them to death. So people like Nandi Netumbo Ndaitwa, the current president, she's the second female president on the African continent that is standing in to ensure that the leadership of this continent is shaped in the right trajectory. She's also saying that our diamonds in Namibia should be in position to be pushed forward to benefit the people of Namibia. So the conversation is moving forward, and not forgetting the legacy of Johnny Pombe Magufuli. Johnny Pombe Magufuli, one of the reasons allegedly was eliminated, was one of the first leaders that did what you call resource capture. He said, our minerals, our resources, and our terms. Our minerals, our independence, and our terms. That's one of the programs that made him so unpopular in the Western world, that they were in a position to also do what you call resource capture. So the conversation is a little bit very interesting to hear that so many African countries and so many African leaders are realizing that we shouldn't be the sources of raw materials, yet we can be in a position to use these raw materials for our own betterment as a continent. So yes, that's it. Let's do another story and let us move to Cuba. Now, of course, the people from Cuba, they call it Cuba. They call it Cuba. Now, there are issues in Cuba. Cuba is a country that is almost between 100 kilometers away from America. When you move into the American East Coast, there are issues in Cuba. Cuba has had issues, most especially during the presidency of Donald Trump. When Barack Obama was around there a little bit, he was a little bit very soft towards the leadership of Cuba. But as we speak now, the fate of Cuba rests on the shoulders of Donald John Trump. Now, let's get a perspective. Cuba is a country that is almost 100 kilometers away from the United States of America. Actually, from Trump's home, because Donald Trump's home is in Maragoro. Maragoro is in Florida, and Florida is almost in what we call the American East Coast. Is in the American East Coast. Now, there are so many issues that have been happening. Cuba is a country that is very far away. I mean, very close. It is the immediate neighbor of America when you move away and you come over the Pacific. It's an island. But as we speak, Cuba has a lot of issues, most especially when it comes to the standards of living. The welfare of the people of Cuba is a little bit very, very depreciated. Definitely because of the sanctions that have been imposed on them or on their regime by the presidency or by the leadership of Donald John Trump. Now, what happened? What has happened? Donald Trump came out and said that Cuba should not get any more oils from Venezuela. Cuba doesn't have their own oil. They were getting their oil from Venezuela. Now, when they took over the leadership of Venezuela, that was under Nicolas Maduro. When Nicolas Maduro got conquered and got occupied, and of course he was replaced by the vice presidency, the lady, she's called Delcy Rodriguez. When Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president of Nicolas Maduro, was installed, it made it a little bit very challenging to the people of Cuba to access what they used to access from Venezuela, because terms and conditions were established by the American leadership that no country, specifically Cuba, cannot have access to the oil resources they used to get from Venezuela. Cuba used to get their oil from Venezuela, but now that the leadership of Venezuela is under Delcy Rodriguez, who was installed by an American, extended hand, it has become a very big problematic for Cuba to move forward. And guess what? The people of Cuba are starving. Cuba has spent almost so many days and days and days without having access to most of the things that they need. So they're in a position to cut off their oil supplies. And Havana is the capital city of Cuba. Most of the times, most of the people are dying in hospitals. Most of the people are dying in hospitals. Why? Because the medical practitioners cannot get to the hospitals. Two, people don't have the money. The economy of Cuba is starving. People don't have food. It was just only one thing. Make sure that Cuba doesn't get oil supplies from Venezuela, and the issues are not okay. There is a lot of starvation in Cuba. People are not going to school. The army is almost, people have demonstrated for quite some time, and you really, really, really wonder how someone can go in a position to make the people starve. Now, this is the technique. What do? If you really don't want the leadership that is in Cuba, what do? You ensure that you starve the people. When the people get starved, it will be easier for them to give up or to do what you call an insurrection. In other words, America is trying to raise an uprising in Cuba. Of course, when the uprising comes up, they will be in a position to do away with the leadership. And of course, America will be in a position to install their puppet that they've always been wanting in there. But guess what? Countries have come in to give a hand, and one of them is China. China was in a position to send them a lot of food. China sent them rice, and China sent them soya peas. They were in a position to give them soya peas that can be in a position to sustain their food, their access to food for almost 30 days. And Cuba is saying, and China is saying, China is calling upon so many other countries that can be in a position to extend a hand such that the people of Cuba cannot starve. The people of Cuba cannot die of hunger because of American response of ensuring that they don't have access to the oils. Now, the people from America have moved from America to go and demonstrate in Cuba. There are so many demonstrations. Some other countries that are planning to extend a hand are Russia. But of course, the involvement of Russia in Cuba will mean a lot. But at least China has tried to extend a hand to the people of Cuba. Now, the point is very simple. They don't agree with the leadership. Yesterday, the president of America, Donald Trump, came up and said that they don't want any close relationship with anyone who comes from the family of Fidel Castro. And we should have a given perspective to understand who is Fidel Castro as far as Cuba is concerned. Now, for so long, like we've said, Cuba is only 100 kilometers away from Florida. That is the American East Coast. When we talk about the American East Coast, we are referring to Florida, Maryland, part of New York, South Carolina, Northern Carolina. Those are the countries that are found on the East Coast. Of course, the West Coast, that is California, which is almost the other side. But of course, we're talking about America on the East Coast. Now, I was trying to make a point of why is it that Donald Trump or the Americans are not comfortable with having a discussion with anyone who is coming from the family of Fidel Castro. What did Fidel Castro do to the Americans? Now, before Cuba turning out to be an enemy of America, they were very close allies. They had a very good relationship, but that was the end in 1959. Now, 1959, Cuba was under the leadership of a gentleman called Fulgencio Batista. Now, Fulgencio Batista was an American puppet that had been installed. Americans were going to Cuba, Bahamas, and Bermuda. Actually, all those countries make up what we call the Bermuda Triangle. The Bermuda Triangle is Bermuda, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. In between those three countries, that's where we find the space that is mysteriously called the Bermuda Triangle, and people are saying there's a lot of energy there that is, influencing, but that's the Bermuda Triangle. It is between Bermuda, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. That is from the American East Coast. But the point I was trying to put up forward is that 1959 rather, America had a puppet kind of leadership in Cuba. That was a gentleman called Fulgencio Batista. Now, Fulgencio Batista was the leader of Cuba, but he was an American puppet. Now, in 1959, Fidel Castro, a Soviet, Fidel Castro, a socialist, was in a position to overthrow the regime of Fulgencio Batista. Now, when Fidel Castro overthrew the regime of Fulgencio Batista, America turned out to have a very, very negative relationship with this island. Now, they didn't stop there. When Fulgencio Batista got overthrown, Fidel Castro established Cuba as a federal state. As a Soviet state or as a socialist state. In a socialist state, everyone is paid equally. We don't have classes of people. People don't get paid on merit. People don't get paid on levels of education. People get paid on levels of agency. In other words, a taxi driver and a border rider can be paid at the same time. That's how Cuba was established during the regime of Fidel Castro. Of course, when Fidel Castro also moved into socialism, this is what made Cuba to be a close ally to Russia. By then, Russia in 1960s was into the leadership of a gentleman called Nikita Khrushchev. So when Russia got to know that Cuba had turned out to be a socialist state, Russia got involved. That was under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev started giving a lot of weapons and a lot of support to Cuba. Why? Because America for so long, they had a little bit of a misunderstanding between them and Russia. And of course, America and Russia are a little bit distant. Now that Russia had gotten an ally who was just 100 kilometers away from America, it made it a little bit easier for them to ensure that the relationship gets a little bit disturbed. And what happened was, Nikita Khrushchev started giving their support to Fidel Castro, who was the leader of Cuba by then. Now, they also embarked on a strong medical system. As we speak in the entire world, almost 90% of the people in Cuba have degrees. Cuba and Iran are the most literate countries in the world. And most of the courses that they study in Cuba is medicine. That's why Cuba is known for exporting medical personnel. As some of our countries are sending our children in Saudi Arabia and Qatar to serve as kadamas, Saudi Arabia and those fake countries where people are mistreated at that level, countries like Cuba are exporting medical personnel. That is a very serious development. So Nikita Khrushchev gets into an alliance with Fidel Castro and they start disorganizing the Americans. By then, America was under the leadership of a gentleman called J.F. Kennedy. We talked about him here yesterday. Now, the CIA started a very serious operation to unseat the regime of Fidel Castro. Actually, by the time he died, Fidel Castro had survived 600 military assassination attempts. The CIA, the FBI, and all those American spy agencies worked so hard to eliminate him. And what was on the record that he survived execution or assassination 600 times. Now, that's the gentleman that you're talking about. Of course, they also tried to get the CIA, and they also put up a very big force. This force was called the Brigade. And it was supposed to go and overthrow the regime of Fidel Castro, 1961. But of course, Fidel Castro was in the know. He got and fought them successfully. Of course, not forgetting the Cuban Missile Crisis and all that. So the relationship of America and Cuba has not been okay. Of course, when Fidel Castro died, his brother took over. Raul Castro took over and led and took over the leadership. But of course, he was also in position to move forward. Now, as we speak, Cuba has a new leadership. But America is not okay with it. So what do? Let the people starve. Make sure that they don't have access to all medical supplies, to what they need to take on the day-to-day affairs. The welfare of the entire island is so much crippled, and people are demonstrating. Surprisingly, they are not demonstrating to call for the collapse, for the giving up of the leadership. They don't want the leaders to resign. They instead want America to stop getting involved in their affairs. But as we speak, mostly, there are so many signals, there are so many indicators that probably America might be interested in probably doing another successful mission, most especially when what is happening in Iran is a failure. So they would like to so much give their attention. Now, during this very year, Donald Trump has been in position to attack almost 4 countries. The first country did, of course, that was Venezuela. Nicolas Maduro was captured and he was locked up in the prison in New York. We are not sure if he's still locked up there, but at least to what we know, that he's locked up in New York. And then from there, his appetite went towards Greenland. His appetite went towards Greenland. And that is what made countries like Denmark, who are fellow members of NATO, a little bit get scared and all that. So that's what also brought a lot of issues between Donald Trump and NATO members. That why is it that a NATO member can attack a NATO member? Of course, in between the Greenland and Denmark issue there, that's when he was in position to declare war over Iran, and Iran got hit, and eventually his attention towards Cuba and his attention towards Denmark and Greenland somehow disappeared. Now that he's losing in Iran, people are saying that he wants to have his attention to Havana Island or to what we call Cuba. But as we speak, there are so many people from America that have joined people in Cuba to demonstrate such that they can call off the American intervention or the American involvement in their country. But like we've said, the fate of Cuba now rests on the shoulders of Donald John Trump. Yeah, that's it. Let's go for a short commercial break. You're still watching New Day on TV1. See the difference. We are going to have our Today in History segment. In history today, we are looking at the last king of Russia. The last king of Russia, Tsar Nicholas II, was enthroned today. That was in 1898. You know, when you talk about Russia, most people so much think about Vladimir Putin. But of course, before Vladimir Putin, before Gorbachev, before Boris Yeltsin, before Nikita Khrushchev, Russia, before Joseph Stalin, Russia was a kingdom, and the last king of Russia was called Tsar Nicholas II. He was enthroned today in 1898. So before we think about Russia as a republic, Russia became a republic during the time after the revolution. Russia had the revolution of 1917, and that revolution is what changed so many things in this country. Of course, from 1917, when Russia went into a revolution, we went into the regime of Lenin. Lenin took over. Around that time, then Stalin, and then the rest of the leaders right away took over leadership. But Tsar Nicholas II was the last Romanov. You know, in Russia, the royal family, the last people that led Russia were called the Romanov dynasty. So we're talking about the Romanov dynasty. Just like how we can talk about the Tudors, one of the biggest families that led in the United Kingdom. That was the family of the Tudors, which was started by Henry VIII, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, Henry VIII, they had the family of the Tudors. Of course, in Australia, one of the biggest families that led for long, it was the family of the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs was a ruling class, or ruling family rather, in some parts of Australia, the entire Australian Empire. But of course, in Russia, it was the Romanov dynasty, or the Romanovs led Russia. And of course, on the 26th of May of 1898, the last king of Russia, Tsar Nicholas II was enthroned. He led Russia from 1898 up to 1917. Things didn't end right. Things didn't end right because he was killed. So Russia went into a revolution of 1917. This revolution is referred to as the Bolshevik Revolution. This revolution was very, very bloody. It is so much led to loss of lives. The king, the Queen Alexandra, and the wife, the Queen, the king, and the family, they were all eliminated by the angry people in Russia. So that is what we had for today, our Today in History. That today in history, the last king of Russia, that was Tsar Nicholas II, was enthroned, how he became a king. Maybe we should look at a little bit of their lineage. One of the greatest Romanovs have said, just like how you can hear of the Tudors, just like how you can hear of the Habsburgs, just like Ngabo Nagamba, like the people of Buganda, waliwo bakabaka bava mu nyumba ya Ssuuna, mu lunyiriri lwa Kabaka Tembo. They are different lineages. So this lineage that we talk about in Russia, it was the lineage of the Romanovs. So the Romanov dynasty started leading Russia in 1700. And one of the greatest Romanov that we had was called Catherine Olga. Very, very terrible woman there. But of course, there was Tsar Peter, there was Tsar Ivan, there was Tsar John. In Russia, by the way, a king is called Tsar. The king is called Tsar. In German, the king was called Kaiser. Now, of course, in the ancient history, this is something that they picked up from Caesar. If you're so much very comfortable with the biblical history, there was a title, someone that was leading over the Roman Empire by then, it was called Caesar. Caesar was the title, but of course when the Germans took over, they called him a Kaiser, and of course when the Russians took over, they referred to him as a Tsar, T-S-A-R. Now Tsar Nicholas, of course, like I've said, he was enthroned in 1898 on the 26th of May, 1898, and he led from 1898 up to 1917. In other words, he led for only 19 years. But I was trying to say that before him, there were other people that were coming from the Romanov dynasty, and I was giving a little bit of some of the kings or some of the leaders that were coming from the Romanov dynasty. One of them that was very instrumental as early as 1700, that was the lady. She was called Tsarina. So the king was called Tsar, and the queen was called Tsarina. Now, Tsarina Catherine led up to 1801. She led from 1795 up to 1801. That was Catherine. And then when Catherine gave up, her son took over. It was called Tsar Paul. Tsar Paul led from 1801 up to 1815. That was the second Tsar, of course, from the Romanov dynasty. So Tsar Paul led from 1801 up to 1815. And then from there, we go to the regime of Tsar Alexander I. Tsar Alexander I led from 1815 up to 1825. When he led from 1815 up to 1825, those are almost 10 years. And then we went into the regime of Tsar Alexander II. Now, the other one was Tsar Alexander I, and then we went to the regime of Tsar Alexander II. Now, this one led from 1825 up to 1855. So from 1825 up to 1855, that's almost 30 years under the fourth Romanov. So from 1855 up to 1861, there was another Romanov who came and took leadership. That was called Tsar Nicholas I. He led from 1855 up to 1861. Now from the regime from 1861 up to 1898, that was another Tsar. This one was called Tsar Alexander III. He led from 1861 up to 1898. Now from 1898 up to 1919, the last Tsar of Russia, Tsar Nicholas II, took over the leadership and he led for 19 years. Now this leadership came to an end through a revolution, what came to be known as the Bolshevik Revolution. Now socialism had started disturbing Russia. By then, Russia was still one of the most ancient countries. It was very ancient. They didn't have clear systems. It was a little bit suffering from the effects of industrialization and the effects of World War I. So Russia went into a revolution, and then that is what brought the leadership of someone called Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin Of course, Lenin was one of the people that led the revolution, and he led up to 1824. 1824 there, he died. So from 1824 up to 1850 something, Joseph Stalin took over leadership, and he was a very, very terrible man. Very, very terrible. Those who were in a position to do some kind of history, you can read about Joseph Stalin. Of course, when Joseph Stalin gave up a leadership, so in other words, kingship in Russia ended with the regime of Tsar Nicholas II. That is the guy, or the king, that was eliminated in the 1919 revolution, and he was killed with his family. And then from 1918 rather, Russia went into a very terrible civil war. After this civil war, Russia never had kings again. Russia became a republic. So that's why I've said the first Republican leader in Russia, a little bit of a republic, though there was a lot of politics there. The first leader that took over from there, he was Lenin. He led from 1918 rather, up to 1824, when he passed on, and then Joseph Stalin took over leadership, and then we come into the regime of so many other people there, including Nikita Khrushchev, including Mikhail Gorbachev, including Boris Yeltsin, and including Vladimir Putin as we speak. So that is it, what you had for you today in today's history, that the last king of Russia was coronated today on the 26th of May, 1896. And since then, kingship in Russia came to an end. As we speak, Russia is a little bit of a republic. Yes, that can be subject to debate, how a republic is, most especially under the leadership of Vladimir Putin. People may not so much understand that Russia is a republic because of how Putin has been in position to handle. Russia is a very big country, by the way. Russia is the biggest country on this planet. Russia is almost 12 times bigger than the United States of America. Russia is almost 80 times bigger than Germany. In Russia, they have 11 time zones. Now, as we speak, in some place in Russia, it can be like maybe 8 as we are. And then in some other part, in that very part of Russia, it is already Wednesday. That's how big Russia is. And Russia is one of the countries that is almost empty. Almost 60% of the Russian land is unoccupied. Russia is very big, to the extent almost the biggest part of Russia doesn't have people. It's very, very empty. You can even imagine. They have a population of almost 190 million people. But the country is very, 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 very big. It is one of the countries that experiences the coldest of the coldest. Actually, in Russia, temperatures can go almost to negative 160 degrees. Negative. None of us, most of us here, cannot survive. If you can't survive because it has just rained, just imagine what it can be or what it can feel like when the temperatures go as cold as negative 150, negative 160, negative 120. That means the country is very, very cold. Probably that's what explains as to why the Russians take a lot of vodka. At the end of the day, you need to put in some allergy to warm up your body. It's because of the coldness. But that's it for today in history. Let us continue with our next segment, Only in Africa. About some of the outstanding achievements and nature that are so much, require a little bit of some information, most especially on the African continent. We highlight some of the issues that stand out on the African continent. And today we are going to talk about a gentleman called Aliko Dangote and why Aliko Dangote is turning out to be a very serious problem on the African continent. Not a problem to not only Africans, but is also standing out to be one of the biggest challenges that is disturbing the Western world. Now, Aliko Dangote, we are not going to profile him, but we are going to talk about the Dangote refineries. because at the end of the day, for the last 3 months now, if it is talking about Africa, you cannot have a conversation. Actually, some of the African leaders are not known. Some of the African leaders are not known. You might be in a position to ask someone that, who is the leader of Namibia? Who is the leader of Mali? Who is the leader of maybe Mauritius? Who is the leader of Cape Verde? Most of those leaders are not known, but at least Dangote, Aliko Dangote, the name sounds out very, very familiar to most of the Africans now. So we'd like to talk about his refinery. Maybe we shall also get time and profile him as an individual. Now, a couple of years ago, for the first time on the African continent, gold, resources like gold and oil, Africa was looked at as a source of raw materials. Not until one Nigerian gentleman changed this kind of conversation. One of the countries that has been so much involved in the exportation of oil, exportation of crude oil on the African continent is Nigeria. Nigeria has done it. Nigeria was one of the first African countries to become a member of what we call the OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Nigeria was a member. But as we speak, Nigeria is one of the most fundamental members, because some of the countries that have been members of OPEC have decided to step out. The last one that has moved out of the OPEC was UAE. Of course, that was the American involvement there. UAE moved out. But also on the African continent, one of the first countries that stepped out, I think in 2018, was Angola. Angola also moved out of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. And what does it do? The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries is so much responsible for rationing, for determining the prices of the world oil, or of oils on the world market. Now, for so long, these conversations have been dealt with amongst Western companies. It has been Shell, it has been Total, it has been JP, those companies that are Rubis, all those French companies have been so much instrumental in having discussions about oil. But as we speak, on the African continent, one black gentleman from Nigeria was in position to say, no, we shouldn't have these negotiations or this kind of narrative shaped by the Western powers. We can also enter into this industry. And Aliko Dangote was in a position to establish his own refinery. Aliko Dangote for so long has been the richest man on the African continent with approximately $20 billion. So he was in position to be like, okay, let me enter into the oil industry. Let me tell you something, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy not only for him as a person, but also for the leadership of Nigeria. When Aliko Dangote negotiated or declared that he had embarked on coming up with the oil refinery, this is when we got to realize that there were so many instabilities in Nigeria. Instabilities that were in Nigeria became so rampant. Most especially, they were targeting, they reached a level of targeting Christians, to the extent that this very year, the American government, under the command of Donald John Trump, the president, they were in a position to launch a mission that got involved in killing and bombing terrorist organizations in the northern eastern part of Nigeria, the Hausa Fulani, and of course the so-called Boko Haram. Now, when Aliko Dangote got involved in here, you got to know that so many Christians in Nigeria were abducted. There were so many uprisings. In America, they got musicians, just like Nicki Minaj. She came out and she was like, okay, she came out and gave a speech appreciating Donald Trump and encouraging him to get involved in Nigerian affairs, as if Nigeria cannot handle their own affairs. But these were all reactions that came after when the European powers got to know that Aliko Dangote got into a refinery. As we speak, ladies and gentlemen, Aliko Dangote has an oil refinery that supplies 650 barrels of oil on a daily basis on the African continent. Now, this may not sound so surprising, but let me tell you something. When this oil refinery got established, so many African countries started getting their oil supplies from Nigeria. That means Western companies, I don't want to mention their names here, Western companies got a little bit scared because they were not being knocked out of business. That probably accounts for the reasons as why there is a lot of instabilities in the western part of Africa. Whenever I talk about West Africa, it's always uprisings and surprisings, instabilities, military coups, and all that. It means a lot. So, of course, the Dangote refinery produces or supplies 650 barrels of oil on a daily basis. So, the first country that made sure that they use Aliko Dangote as their oil supply was Ghana. because Ghana is a neighbor, Nigeria. Now, so many other countries started getting oil from Nigeria. Now, the issue came on crude oil. Now, you put up the refinery, but you need to have access to the crude oil. For the first time, Nigeria denied access. A Nigerian was denied access to Nigerian oil. Of course, under leadership of Bola Tinubu. As we speak, Nigeria is under leadership of Bola Tinubu. But of course, because of a lot of pressure and somehow, somewhere, Nigeria was given, and Aliko Dangote was given access. Aliko Dangote used to get his crude oil from Venezuela. He used to get his crude oil from Angola. He was a Nigerian with an oil refinery in Nigeria, but he couldn't have access to the crude in Nigeria. Now, that's the kind of politics that we are talking about. This is a very, very, very serious game. He would move across the Indian Ocean and then, the Atlantic, and he moves to this side of Venezuela and gets his crude oil. Now, of course, things have turned out to be a little bit better. Now, so many African countries, including the most industrialized country, South Africa, as we speak, gets 70% of their oil supplies from Nigeria. From the pipeline, from the oil refinery that has been so much established by Aliko Dangote. Now, Aliko Dangote is not only investing in oil refinery, he's also investing in so many things that we import. He has a cement industry. As we speak, he's also establishing a very, very big fertilizer industry in Ethiopia. Most of the fertilizers, the phosphates and all that Western companies and Western farms or African farmers use, they are not manufactured from here. Yet all the resources that we need to have all the serious, stable fertilizers are on the African continent. So that's why Aliko Dangote is like, no, let me not only invest in the oil refinery, let me also get into a fertilizers industry. And that is what is embarking on in Ethiopia. Now, as we speak, Aliko Dangote is extending his investment level to the extent that is coming into the East African region. 2 weeks ago, there was a summit that was 3 weeks ago. There was a summit that was held in Kenya before the Africa Forward Summit, which was called by Emmanuel Macron. There was a summit that was called the Africa We Build. The Africa We Build was hosted by William Samoei Ruto. And of course, one of the biggest guests was General Yoweri Kaguta Museveni from Uganda, where they had discussion, and the keynote speaker was Aliko Dangote. And the discussion was, how can East Africa establish their oil refinery as well? But of course, Uganda is also embarking on its own refinery, which will be in position to produce 60,000 barrels on a daily basis, in Uganda. Now, in other words, the oil refinery that Dangote established in Nigeria is almost 600 times bigger than that of Uganda, because the one of Uganda will be in position to produce 60,000 barrels on a daily basis, while that one of Aliko Dangote will be in position to produce 650 barrels of oil on a daily basis. That's what makes it a little bit easier for the East African region. So Aliko Dangote didn't stop in West Africa or Nigeria. He has also moved into the East African region. And the idea is, how can we have an oil refinery besides what Uganda has in Hoima? How can we also have our own refinery? Of course, the discussions were they would needed to have it in Tanga, which I so much fought, and I think Aliko Dangote listened to me. But of course, he didn't listen in a good way, because at the end of the day, from Tanga, the idea now, they want to have it in Mombasa. They want to have it in Mombasa. But of course, if you happen to look at the reasoning behind, is that the oil supplies that we have in Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania cannot be in a position to supply how big, the big oil refinery Aliko Dangote is planning to establish. So it's like, no, I may need to have a little bit of some crude imported from some areas. And how can I have access to the crude? I should be in position to have it located on an area that is strategically located and that can give me easy access. And the easy access is at Mombasa, because the Mombasa is on what we call the East African coastline. Now, as we speak, Aliko Dangote is still moving forward as one of the richest men on the African continent. The Aliko Dangote refinery is doing wonders, and is not only just stopping in Nigeria, is also moving to other parts of the country, other parts of the continent. And like we've said, is also thinking of coming up with some level of investment in the East African region. And we should be very happy as well, because is speaking to already a converted gentleman. The president of Uganda, General Kaguta Museveni, was like, no, our oil cannot get out until when we have a refinery. By the way, that sounds a little bit very mature, taking a decision at that level, most especially when you have Western pressure. Because when the oil refinery was set up in Nigeria, one of the bigger issues that Aliko Dangote, the World Bank came up with a report about the Aliko Dangote refinery. And I can quote some of the issues that the World Bank highlighted. They said that Aliko Dangote's oil is more expensive than the oil that was coming from other companies. In other words, the oil companies that were supplying to African countries, their oil was cheaper 12% than the oil that was supplied by the Aliko Dangote refinery. You were like, so they were saying that the oil that is coming from all these oil companies is cheaper by 12% compared to what Dangote was supplying. In other words, they were saying that Aliko Dangote is exploiting Africans. But of course, Africans didn't listen. And then they brought in some other part in that very discussion. They said that it's not good enough for a country like Nigeria to rely only on one oil refinery. What if shortages come in? Now, they were trying to put it up like they care about how Nigerians suffer. But they don't care when the Boko Haram are killing people in the northern part of Nigeria. They don't so much care about that. You understand? It is their companies that have been selling oil, their oil exorbitantly on African resources, yet oil. Now, this is what the biggest challenging part. Since 1970, Nigeria has been one of the biggest oil suppliers. What Nigeria does, they get their crude, they give it to BP, they give it to Shell and all those companies. They take it in Europe. That's the crude, the raw material. They process it and then they bring back the finished product. Now, oil, the crude, has so many industries that can be established, not only oil. You can have fertilizers, you can have plastics, you can have Vaseline, you can have tires, you can have a lot of products that would be so much processed from the crude. Now, Britain or the United Kingdom was getting the crude and they take everything. Now, the only thing that they would bring back to Nigeria was oil, which was sold also exorbitantly. Now, all the byproducts that would be so much help African countries to get out of the unemployment problem that we have on this continent, they were all taken. That's why this very year, Bola Tinubu was in a position to visit the United Kingdom. And we did a story here that for the last 32 years, Nigerian presidents have not been visiting the United Kingdom. I don't know, those who are following us, we did that story. For the last 32 years, Nigerian presidents have not been visiting the United Kingdom. Of course, we talk about Muhammadu Buhari, we talk about Jonathan Goodluck, we talk about all those leaders that have been in position to lead Nigeria. All of them were not visiting, all of them were not moving to Britain. Now, it was Bola Tinubu this very year that was the first leader of Nigeria for the last, I think, since the regime of Sani Abacha. And Sani Abacha led Nigeria up to 1993 or 1998, if I'm not mistaken. He led Nigeria up to around that time. That's when the relationship between Nigeria and the United Kingdom got a little bit of some, misunderstandings. Now, since then, no Nigerian president had ever visited the United Kingdom. Now, Bola Tinubu was the first one to visit. And of course, the issue was, why are you not telling Dangote to do that? And guess what? Amidst the Ukraine war, and amidst the war that is between Israel, America, and Iran, Europe is one of the countries that has been hit by oil crisis. They don't have oil. And guess where they're returning to? All of them right now are coming to Nigeria. It's Aliko Dangote. The refinery of Aliko Dangote is powering Western industries. So the 650 barrels that Aliko Dangote refinery is producing on a daily basis is becoming out to be one of the biggest hands that are not only helping the African countries to get a little bit empowered, but is also empowering the Western countries. Why? Because they are no longer getting oil from Russia. that is on their own terms, because they say by 2027 we should not be in a position to trade with Russia. All Russian oil supplies should not be in a position to come to our countries. So they voluntarily stopped Russia. Now, when the Iran war started, United States of America lifted their ban on Russian oil. In other words, they allowed Russia to start selling their oil again to European countries, yet it was them voluntarily that had stopped themselves from getting involved or from trading or from accessing oil from Russia. You know what Putin did? Russia said, no, Russia is not selling any oil outside. Now they were starving. Now, the other alternative was the Persian Gulf. This is Kuwait, this is Qatar, this is Oman, this is Iraq, this is UAE, this is Qatar, and this is Bahrain. And guess what? The Strait of Hormuz gets closed. When the Strait of Hormuz gets closed, they don't have access to the oil. And guess what? The people that were fighting against the Dangote oil refinery, they are coming back to ensure that they get some oil from the Dangote oil refinery. Now, this sounds out as one of the most success stories that you can ever hear on the African continent. And by the way, as we speak, Dangote's company is supposed to be launched. I think I should be in position to check on some details here. That company is supposed to go on IPO. In other words, Dangote is going to put its shares on market. So if you really have some money and you feel like you want to be one of the shareholders in the Dangote oil refinery, you can check it out and be one of the shareholders of one of the greatest industry, of one of the greatest oil refinery on this planet. Actually, not so many European oil refineries can be in a position to produce the 650 barrels of oil on a daily basis. Not so many. So you almost have the biggest oil refinery on the African continent, but it also outputs most of the oil refineries in Europe and some American oil refineries. So, but surprisingly, good enough, it is not only stopping there, we are also having the oil refinery. Dangote is not only extending his hand to help the people in West Africa, he's also coming to the West African part to ensure that we can also get out of the challenges of oil and the sharp oil prices that have always been spiking up because of a few misunderstandings here and there. And the fact that it's located in Western Africa, it makes it a little bit easier for them to sail towards the Atlantic waters and then give or supply the oils to different African countries. So that's it for our Only in Africa segment. We just wanted to highlight on what we call the Dangote oil refinery. And let's do our last story of the day. Now, the last story of the day is India. India is drawing closer to the European Union. India is drawing closer to the European Union. Now, so many countries have had issues with India. But in the last 6 months, we've seen almost all members, all leaders of the European Union moving to India. Now, before they moved to China, because we've seen most of them moving to China, by the way, there is a very global shift. If you've not been in a position to realize, there is a very, very global shift. That's why the leadership of a given country as we speak determines a lot. Maybe I'll come back to that. Now, you've been in position to realize that there is a very, very serious global shift, most especially in the global north and in the global south. There are so many challenges. Now, there are leaders that have been in position to visit India. Let's name them. One of them was Emmanuel Macron. Of course, Macron has been everywhere because France is struggling. We've always been telling you, by the way. I think tomorrow we shall do a list of the 7 collapsing countries, and you'll be surprised. 7 collapsing states, the states that are collapsing, and France is one of them. This is not Lugambo. We shall be in a position to give out some facts like that people can understand what we're talking about. Of course, Keir Starmer went to India. Emmanuel Macron has been to India. Vladimir Putin went to India, by the way, this very year, and so far, he has been the biggest leader that has been received. If you look at the entourage and the reception of Vladimir Putin in India, it was very, very amazing. Narendra Modi received him like he was receiving the world boss. It was very, very beautiful to see. Now that's Keir Starmer as well. You know, all of them, that is Vladimir Putin, the one that you're looking at on the screen. That's the time when he visited Narendra Modi in India. That's Keir Starmer, the leader of the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So the point is, what is really happening? That is Zelensky, the leader of Ukraine. Why is it that you are having so many leaders move to India? Now let's get some facts right. India is one of the most growing economies, the fastest growing economies in Asia. It's India and China. Remember, they all have a population issue. China is almost 1.5 billion people. India is almost 1.3 billion people. They all have the numbers. Actually, the biggest, the most populated continent on this planet is Asia. Because if the world has almost 7.2 billion people, Asia only has 4 billion. On that 4 billion, China has 1 billion, India has 1 billion, Indonesia has 1 billion. So Africa, the entire continent, we are around almost 1 billion. But one country, China, is 1.5 billion. One country, India, is 1.3 billion. One country, Indonesia, is 1.2 billion. So Asia is the most populated continent. Now, as I was speaking, amongst the countries that are fastest growing on the Asian continent, actually in the entire world, India stands out to be one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Don't forget, they have the population advantage. 2, they are also the leaders in pharmaceutical and technology. All the pharmaceutical industries of the West, all the pharmaceutical companies of the West are so much led by Indians. Indians are the leaders in pharmacy. Let's talk about those in Qatar, those in Nigeria, everywhere. Anything to do with the pharmacy, they are Indians on top. Actually, India has the biggest remittances. Ugandans abroad send almost 1.2 billion shillings on a daily basis. Sorry, on an annual basis. In other words, Ugandans that work abroad, they send only 1.2 billion on an annual basis. Indians that are working outside India send almost 350 billion on an annual basis. Now that's almost 300 times bigger than what Ugandans from outside Uganda send, what we call the domestic remittances. So the point is, India is that superb. India has developed in terms of the pharmaceutical industry, in technology and all that. And they also have the population advantage. Now, some of the Western powers think that they can be in a position to control balance of power between China and India using India. Because India is a little bit democratic, according to them. They believe that India is a little bit democratic because at its leaders are voted for. In China, it's the Communist Party. So Western powers believe that you rather have a little bit of a democracy promoted and work with rather than working with the so-called socialist arrangement or communist arrangement in Russia. In China. So that's why most of the European powers so much free. Feel a little bit very comfortable to so much align with India. Now, as we speak, Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, is also on a trip. He has been in the Scandinavian countries. He has also visited Schengen. The Schengen countries, we are referring to Belgium, Netherlands, and all there. And then the Scandinavian countries, we are referring to Norway. We are referring to those countries in the northern part of the Baltic Sea, around that very area. So as we speak, Narendra Modi is also taking a European trip. He's also taking a European trip, and is so much trying to sign up terms and conditions and protocols that can be in a position to favor India and India as a state to be in a position to benefit awesomely from the relationship that they've been having with the Western powers. But where does this leave Russia? Because as we speak, when Vladimir Putin visited Russia this very year, by the way, I think it was around February or March, when Vladimir Putin visited America, Donald Trump, one of the countries that he imposed the sanctions on, higher tariffs on, because of their trade with Russia, was India. Actually, I think the tariffs went almost up to 50%. That was Donald Trump using tariffs to ensure that he neglects, somehow negates the relationship, the trading relationship between Russia and India. And somehow India was almost giving in. That's why Vladimir Putin had to go and visit India. And in the conversation that they had, Vladimir Putin told Narendra Modi of India that why should Americans stop you from dealing with us? Yet America itself is dealing with us. For so long, all European countries have decided to terminate their relationship or their economic relationship with the Russians. As all other countries were terminating their economic trade businesses with Russia, America itself, the country that was pushing them, forcing them to do it, didn't. Because from the words of Vladimir Putin said, it is us that empower the nuclear sites of America. In other words, Vladimir Putin said, America gets nuclear fuels, the nuclear fuels that empower their nuclear facilities or their nuclear reactors or nuclear plants from Russia. Why is it that they are stopping you, India, to trade with us? That was a little bit of a serious eye-opener. Yes, but of course we've seen also German and their Chancellor Merz moving to India and so many other leaders moving to India. But the idea, like I've said, it is you rather have a little bit of stability. You rather have a little bit of stability with a big democrat as Libya, though they say, than having a working relationship with a country like China that is so much regarded to as a communist power that is not seen as one of the democratic kind of states as far as international diplomacy is concerned. So India is moving close to the European Union, but guess what? The European Union is collapsing. That's one of the biggest debates that we need to understand. The European Union is collapsing. There is no money in the European Union. There is no money in the European Union. Most of the European countries are struggling. Actually, last year, if I'm not mistaken, if it wasn't last year, December, or this year, January, Donald Trump, there was a report that was done by an American institute. That report was somehow taken away. The report shows that European countries, these were words of Donald Trump, that European countries are struggling. First of all, they have what's called a demographic winter. Demographic winter means that they have almost old population. Their population is elderly. They don't want to produce. Most of the women in Europe that so much pushed into the system of career growth and development, they don't have kids. They are struggling. They don't have young people. That's why I said they are experiencing what we call demographic winter, that their population is very old. Most of them are homosexuals. They are getting involved in such forms of sex deviations. And the two, Trump himself said that Europe is experiencing what we call a cultural decay. These were words of Donald Trump. Europe is experiencing what we call a cultural decay. And when we mention countries like France failing to come up with a functioning government, when you mention countries like United Kingdom failing to have a functioning prime minister in the last 7 years, when we mention countries like Italy, that has had a lot of demonstrations under the leadership of Meloni, we are not just biased. When you mention like countries like Spain, as we speak, people on the streets. As we speak in France, France has had almost 400 demonstrations. Strikes, people are on the streets demonstrating. So these are some of the indicators that show that there is a very global shift, there is a very serious shift in a global order. And basically, with the leadership of people like Aliko Dangote, Africa can be in position to position themselves as a strategic partner, as a strategic country that can be in position to deal business or to do business that favors them. We do business on our own terms, not on the terms of the countries that have been exploiting this continent for so long. I want to thank you so much for following. Since we started these programs from 7 a.m., this is New Day on TV1. Let's catch up tomorrow from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. It has been Dr. Samau Chauskek representing the entire team of New Day, Regan, Rita, Jack. Thank you so much for making this happen. Let's meet tomorrow, same time. You're still watching TV1. See the difference.